the star of the silver screen. The morning sun began to filter through the windows of the barracks, casting a warm and gentle glow over the room where Gomer Pyle was diligently practicing his vocal warm-ups. He stood with his back straight, focusing on the clarity of each syllable as he repeated the familiar tongue twister about the seashells by the seashore over and over again. His voice was bright and full of a natural, infectious energy that seemed to brighten the very air around him. Just as he reached the peak of his practice, the door opened, and in walked Sergeant Carter, who seemed to be in a state of peculiar physical agitation. Gomer stopped his chanting and greeted his superior with his usual wide and friendly smile, asking if the sergeant was ready for the big day ahead. The studio car was expected to arrive in just a few minutes to whisk them away to the movie set. Sergeant Carter, however, did not answer immediately. Instead, he continued to twist his torso and stretch his arms in a series of exaggerated movements. When Gomer inquired about what he was doing, the sergeant explained with great solemnity that he was loosening up. Today was the day they were scheduled to shoot the most important scenes of the production, and he felt it was his duty as a professional to be physically and vocally prepared. The sergeant then began his own set of vocal exercises, reciting the tale of Peter Piper and the peck of pickled peppers with a booming and authoritative voice. Gomer was genuinely impressed, noting that the sergeant sounded just like a seasoned professional actor from the big city. However, Gomer gently suggested that perhaps the sergeant should practice the specific line he was actually going to say in the movie. Sergeant Carter waved off the concern, confident that he had mastered his single line perfectly. He felt that the difficult tongue twisters were merely a necessary warm-up for his instrument. When Gomer asked to hear the line, Sergeant Carter took a deep breath, puffed out his chest, and delivered the words with grand dramatic flair, announcing that they should all hear it for Henshaw. He explained to Gomer that while the line was simple, he had to be prepared for any direction the filmmaker might give him. He imagined scenarios where he might be required to deliver the line while scaling a flagpole or perhaps while crawling through the dirt on his belly. He wanted to be ready for anything the artistic process demanded of him. Gomer, on the other hand, confessed that he was glad he did not have any spoken lines to worry about, as he feared the pressure would make him far too nervous. He was perfectly content to simply sing his song and contribute to the joy of the scene. As they waited, Sergeant Carter began to tilt his head from side to side, peering into a small mirror to determine which side of his face was the most photogenic. He was convinced that every great actor had a best side, and he was determined to ensure the camera captured his most heroic profile. He hoped the director would choose to film him in a full-face shot, believing that to be his most striking angle. Upon arriving at the bustling movie studio, the atmosphere was electric with the movement of technicians and the bright glare of production lights. A busy assistant director moved through the crowd, calling for Gomer Pyle and directing him to the primary makeup room. The director, Mr. Miles, wanted the head makeup artist to personally attend to Gomer. Sergeant Carter, feeling his own importance, stepped forward to introduce himself as the man with the line, expecting similar royal treatment. However, the assistant director simply pointed him toward the general makeup room with the rest of the extras. The sergeant felt a momentary sting of disappointment, wondering if he might need a more specialized application of cosmetics to enhance his performance, but the hurried pace of the production left no room for his vanity. On the set, the tension began to mount. Sergeant Carter, in an attempt to stand out as a leader, had convinced a makeup assistant to provide him with a false mustache. When Mr. Miles noticed the new addition to the sergeant's face, he was far from impressed. He pointed out that as a sergeant, his stripes were quite enough to make him stand out, and he ordered the mustache to be removed immediately. Time was money, and the director was eager to begin the complex production number. Mr. Miles gathered the group to explain the emotional heart of the scene. He described a story of redemption where a character named Henshaw, previously disliked by his peers for his perceived arrogance, had performed a heroic act by saving a comrade from a burning aircraft. Now, the group was gathered to welcome him back with a surprise celebration. It was meant to be a moment of pure joy and reconciliation. The sergeant's role was crucial. He was to provide the cue for the entire celebration to erupt. At the director's signal, he was to look at Henshaw and deliver his line, which would then trigger the balloons, the music, and a young woman named Gloria popping out of a giant decorative cake. The first take began with a sense of high expectation. The cameras began to roll, and the lights shone brightly. However, when the moment of the cue arrived, the sergeant remained frozen. The pressure of the lights and the hundreds of eyes watching him had caused his mind to go completely blank. Mr. Miles called for a halt and encouraged the sergeant to relax, noting that such nerves were common for a first-time performer. Gomer, ever the supportive friend, suggested that the sergeant try a technique he had read about in a movie magazine, involving letting his body go limp and wiggling his fingers to release the tension. As the afternoon progressed, the situation grew increasingly difficult. During the second take, the sergeant was so anxious that he shouted his line far too early, jumping the cue and ruining the timing of the special effects. By the third take, the sergeant's tongue became twisted, and instead of calling for Henshaw, he accidentally shouted for Peter Piper. Each failed attempt required the crew to reset the balloons, the streamers, and the champagne bottles, which was becoming an expensive and exhausting process. Inside the giant cake, Gloria was becoming increasingly frustrated and warm, as she had to be tucked back inside time after time. By the time they reached take number 14 and then 15, the director's patience was wearing thin. The sergeant was sweating under the intense heat of the studio lamps, requiring constant attention from the makeup team to mop his brow. Despite his best intentions and his hours of practice, the simple act of speaking on camera seemed to be an insurmountable challenge. When they finally reached take number 32, the special effects team announced that they had run out of champagne and balloons. The production was forced to wrap for the day, leaving everyone feeling deflated. Back at the hotel, Gomer tried his best to console his friend. He reminded the sergeant that even the greatest movies, like Gone with the Wind, faced many challenges during filming. He truly believed that the sergeant had delivered the line beautifully at least once, and that the failure must have been due to some technical error behind the scenes. The sergeant clung to this hope, convinced that he would find his rhythm the following morning. However, behind the scenes, Mr. Miles had made a difficult executive decision. He could not afford another day of delays. He instructed his assistant not to call Sergeant Carter back to the set the next day. Instead, he decided to give the line to Gomer Pyle, whose natural ease and singing talent had already proven to be reliable. The next morning, Gomer was troubled when he realized the sergeant had not received a call to return to the studio. He tried to rationalize it, suggesting to the sergeant that perhaps he was being given extra time to rest because he was such a pivotal character. The sergeant, though confused, accepted this explanation, imagining himself receiving the privileged treatment of a major movie star. When Gomer arrived at the set, he pleaded with Mr. Miles to reconsider. He explained how much this role meant to the sergeant and how hard he had practiced. Gomer feared that if the sergeant was cut from the movie, he would be too embarrassed to ever face the men back at the base. Mr. Miles was sympathetic but firm. The production had to move forward. He insisted that Gomer take over the line. Gomer's heart was heavy as the filming began. His first attempt at the line was lackluster because his thoughts were with his friend. Mr. Miles noticed the change in Gomer's energy and realized that the young man's performance was tied to his loyalty to his sergeant. In a moment of creative inspiration, the director found a solution that would satisfy the needs of the film and protect the pride of the sergeant. He called Sergeant Carter back to the studio, not to deliver the line, but to play the most important role of all, the injured comrade whom Henshaw had saved. This role required no spoken lines, but placed the sergeant at the very center of the emotional climax, covered in dramatic bandages that made him look like a true hero. The final take was a magnificent success. Gomer delivered the line with perfect enthusiasm, and as the song began, the entire room erupted in a genuine celebration. The sergeant, lying on a stretcher with his face artistically bandaged, played his part with a silent intensity that moved everyone on set. It was a moment of true cinematic magic. Later, as they watched the filmed footage, Gomer praised the sergeant's performance, telling him that his silent acting was full of deep emotion. The sergeant, now feeling like a veteran of the industry, concluded that while show business was an interesting experience, his true calling remained with the Marine Corps. As they walked away from the studio, a young boy approached them, asking for an autograph. The sergeant, with a newfound sense of grace and a touch of professional modesty, signed the paper as Sergeant Vincent Carter of the United States Marine Corps, forever carrying the memory of the day he was a star of the silver screen.